The morning sun cast golden light across the crystal spires of Solace, the capital city of Kepler 442b. Queen Lyra stood on her palace balcony, watching her people go about their daily lives. Children played in the floating gardens while their parents tended to the healing centers that made the Zalari famous across the galaxy. For 3,000 years, her people had lived in peace, sharing their medical knowledge with anyone who asked for help. That peace was about to end. A tremor shook the palace walls. In the distance, dark shapes appeared in the sky, growing larger by the second. Queen Lyra's advisor, General Kiran, rushed onto the balcony. His face was pale with fear. "Your Majesty, the Vorton fleet has arrived. Our sensors count over 200 ships." Queen Lyra felt her heart sink. She had hoped the reports were wrong, that the Vorton Empire would leave her peaceful world alone. The Zalari had no armies, no weapons of war. They were healers, not fighters. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Perhaps a few hours before they begin landing troops," Kiran replied. "Our shields can hold for a while, but not forever." The queen nodded and walked back into the palace. In the communications center, technicians worked frantically at their stations. She sat down at the main console and began recording a message that would be sent to every corner of the galaxy. "This is Queen Lyra of the Zalari people on Kepler 442b. We are under attack by the Vorton Empire. We have no military to defend ourselves. We are a peaceful people who have spent centuries healing the sick and wounded of many worlds. We ask for help from any who will listen. Please, if there is anyone out there who believes in justice, we need your aid." The message was broadcast on every frequency the Zalari knew. It traveled through hyperspace channels, emergency beacons, and diplomatic networks. Within hours, it reached dozens of civilized worlds across the galaxy. Meanwhile, far from the Zalari homeworld, Captain Jake Morrison was having a quiet day aboard the human exploration ship USS Horizon. His crew was mapping an asteroid field on the edge of known space when communications officer Danny Clark picked up something strange. "Captain, I'm getting a weak signal on the emergency frequency," Danny said. "It's not in any language our computers recognize." Jake walked over to the communications station. The signal was faint and full of static, but there was definitely something there. "Can you clean it up?" "Working on it, sir." Danny's fingers danced across his controls. Slowly, the static cleared, and a voice came through the speakers. It was speaking in an alien language, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was asking for help. "Get Lieutenant Wang up here," Jake ordered. "She studied xenolinguistics before she joined the Navy." Sarah Wang arrived on the bridge 5 minutes later. She listened to the message several times, her face growing more serious with each replay. "Captain, this is definitely a distress call. I can make out a few key words. They're talking about an attack, about needing help. The speaker sounds desperate." Jake stared at the display showing their current position. They were months away from Earth, exploring regions no human had ever seen. But someone out there was in trouble. "Danny, can you trace where this signal came from?" "Yes, sir." "It's coming from a system about 6 days away at maximum warp. The signal is getting weaker, though. Whatever's happening there, it's happening now." Jake made his decision. "Set course for the source of that signal. Maximum warp." "Sir," said his first officer, Commander Tim Brooks, "shouldn't we contact Earth Command first? We don't know what we're flying into." "By the time we contact Earth and get orders back, whoever sent that message might be dead," Jake replied. "We'll send a report on our way, but right now, we're the only ones who can help." Back on Kepler 442b, The first Vorthan ships were landing outside Solace. Queen Lyra watched from her command center as dark-armored soldiers poured out of the landing craft. The Vorthons were known throughout the galaxy as conquerors. They took what they wanted and destroyed what they couldn't use. "Any responses to our distress call?" she asked. The head technician, a young Zalari named Veltar, shook his head sadly. "Nothing, Your Majesty. The signal reached at least 40 different worlds, but no one has answered." Queen Lyra felt tears forming in her eyes. She had expected this, but the reality still hurt. The galaxy was full of advanced civilizations with powerful fleets, but none of them wanted to risk a fight with the Vorthans. Her people were alone. "Keep broadcasting the message," she ordered. "Maybe someone will still hear us." The first explosions echoed across the city as Vortan forces began their attack. The Zalari had some defensive shields and a few security forces, but they were no match for a real army. Buildings began to collapse as Vorthan heavy weapons opened fire. General Kiran appeared at the Queen's side. "Your Majesty, we need to evacuate you to the underground shelters." "No," Queen Lyra said firmly. "If my people are going to suffer, I will suffer with them. Keep broadcasting that message until the very end." Miles above the planet's surface, Admiral Corax of the Vorthon Empire watched the bombardment from his flagship. The Zalari were putting up no real resistance, just as he had expected. Their planet would be conquered within days, and their healing technology would belong to the Vorthon Empire. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "the aliens are still broadcasting their distress call. Should we jam their signals?" Corax laughed. "Let them broadcast. No one in the galaxy is foolish enough to fight us for a planet full of weaklings. Besides, it amuses me to think of their desperation growing as no one answers their call." But Corax was wrong. Far away, a small human ship was racing through hyperspace, its crew determined to answer a call for help that the rest of the galaxy had chosen to ignore. Captain Jake Morrison didn't know what he would find when he reached the Zalari system, but he knew one thing for certain: someone was in trouble, and humans didn't abandon people in need. The USS Horizon pushed its engines to the limit, streaking through the darkness of space toward a world under siege. In a few days, the galaxy would learn that Earth's children had very different ideas about what it meant to hear a cry for help. The massive space station known as Nexus Prime floated in neutral space, far from any star system. For over 1,000 years, it had served as the meeting place for the Galactic Council, where representatives from hundreds of worlds came together to discuss trade, treaties, and the great issues of the day. The station was a marvel of engineering, with sections designed for dozens of different alien environments. In the Central Assembly Hall, Ambassador Zethkar of the Altarian Federation stood before the gathered delegates. His blue skin was marked with the ritual scars that showed his rank, and his 4 arms gestured expressively as he spoke. "Honored colleagues," Zethkar began, "we have received a distress call from the Zalari homeworld. As you all know, the Zalari have been valuable members of our galactic community for centuries. Their medical knowledge has saved countless lives across our worlds." The assembly hall was filled with beings from across the galaxy. The tall, thin Quellians sat in their crystal chairs, their large eyes reflecting the light. The heavily armored Draknari warriors stood at attention, as was their custom. The wealthy representatives of the Centauri Merchants Guild lounged in their luxury seats, checking their profit reports even during the meeting. "The situation is grave," Zethkar continued. "The Vorthon Empire has launched a full invasion of Kepler 442b. The Zalari have no military to defend themselves. They are calling for help from the galactic community. A murmur ran through the assembly. Everyone knew about the Vorthans. They were conquerors who had built their empire by taking what they wanted from weaker civilizations. Their fleet was one of the most powerful in the galaxy. Counselor Vextos of the Draknari stood up to speak. Despite being from a warrior culture, his words were cautious. The Draknari value honor and the protection of the innocent, he said. But we must consider the practical realities. The Vorthan fleet numbers over 1,000 ships. Any force sent to help the Zalari would face overwhelming odds. From her observation booth high above the main floor, Dr. Lisa Parker watched the proceedings with growing dismay. As Earth's newly appointed observer to the Galactic Council, she had no vote in the assembly, but she could see where this discussion was heading. Lisa was a diplomat who had spent years learning about alien cultures, but she was also human, and humans had strong feelings about abandoning people in need. The Quellian representative, Speaker Thylos, spoke next. The Quellians were known for their advanced technology and logical thinking. Our analysis shows that the Vorthan Empire has never directly threatened established council members, Thylos said in their melodic voice. While we sympathize with the Zalari situation, we must ask ourselves if intervention is wise. The Vorthans might see any military action as a declaration of war against their empire. Several other delegates nodded in agreement. The galaxy had been mostly peaceful for centuries, with only minor conflicts between smaller powers. No one wanted to start a war with the Vorthans. The representative from the Centauri Merchants Guild, Trademaster Golan, stood up next. His species looked almost human, except for their silver skin and completely black eyes. "Let us be practical," Golan said. "What do the Zalari offer in return for our protection? Yes, they have medical knowledge, but each of our worlds already has adequate health care. The cost of fighting the Vorthans would be enormous. Where is the profit in such a venture?" Lisa felt sick listening to the debate. These beings were talking about the Zalari as if they were just numbers in a business deal. She thought about the reports she had read describing Zalari society, a peaceful people who had spent generations perfecting the art of healing, who had never harmed anyone. Ambassador Krellin of the Hegemony of Independent Worlds spoke up. His people were known for their neutrality in galactic affairs. "The Hegemony has always believed that each world should solve its own problems," he said. "If we intervene every time a stronger power attacks a weaker one, where does it end? We could spend all our time fighting other people's wars." The debate continued for hours. One by one, the major powers of the galaxy explained why they could not help the Zalari. The reasons varied. Some claimed it was too dangerous, others said it was too expensive, and still others argued that intervention would set a bad precedent. Finally, Ambassador Zethkar called for a vote. All those in favor of sending military aid to the Zalari homeworld? Lisa watched as the voting board lit up with results. Red lights showed votes against intervention. Green lights showed votes in favor. The board was almost entirely red. Only 3 small green lights appeared, the Zalari's 2 closest allies, and 1 abstention. The final count was devastating. 847 votes against, 3 votes in favor. The Altarian ambassador's shoulders slumped in defeat. "The motion fails," he announced. "The Galactic Council will not intervene in the Vorthan invasion of Kepler 442b. As the delegates began to file out of the assembly hall, many of them already discussing their next business dealings, Lisa remained in her observation booth. She pulled out her communicator and sent an urgent message to Earth. "This is Dr. Lisa. Parker reporting from Nexus Prime," she said. "The Galactic Council has voted not to help the Zolari. They're abandoning an entire civilization to save themselves the trouble of fighting. I'm sending all the details of the Zolari situation to Earth Command. Someone needs to know what's happening here." Down on the main floor, a small group of delegates gathered around Ambassador Zethkar. These were representatives from minor worlds that had voted in favor of helping the Zolari, but lacked the military power to act alone. "Is there nothing we can do?" asked Ambassador Rilke of the Peaceful Alliance. Zethkar shook his head sadly. "Without the major powers, we don't have enough ships to make a difference. The Vorthons would destroy us easily." As the group dispersed, Zethkar noticed someone approaching. It was the human observer, Dr. Parker. She looked angry and determined. "Ambassador," Lisa said, "I want you to know that not everyone is going to stay silent about this." "Dr. Parker," Zethkar replied, "I understand your feelings, but what can your people do? Earth has only recently joined Galactic Society. Your fleet is tiny compared to the major powers." Lisa looked the alien diplomat in the eye. "Maybe," she said, "but humans have different ideas about what it means to help people in trouble. We don't calculate profit margins when someone's crying for help." As Lisa walked away, Zethkar watched her go with interest. He had studied human culture and knew they had a reputation for unpredictable behavior. Perhaps there was still hope for the Zolari after all. In her private quarters aboard the observation section, Lisa composed a detailed report for Earth. She included everything. She had learned about the Zolari situation, the Vorthon invasion, and the Council's refusal to act. As she sent the message toward Earth, she whispered a prayer that her people would prove different from the rest of the galaxy. The message streaked through hyperspace, carrying news that would soon reach the ears of those who might actually answer the Zolari's desperate call for help. The emergency meeting room deep inside the Pentagon was filled with tension. President Maria Santos sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by the top military and civilian leaders of the Terran Federation. The holographic displays around the room showed star charts, fleet positions, and intelligence reports about the Vorthon Empire. Admiral Roy Collins, the head of Earth Defense Command, stood beside a large display showing the Zolari system. His weathered face showed the strain of 30 years of military service. "The situation is clear," he said. "The Zolari homeworld is under attack by a force we can't match. The Vorthans have over 200 ships in their invasion fleet alone. We have 40 combat vessels in our entire navy." General Carl Hughes leaned forward in his chair. As head of the Terran Marine Corps, he was responsible for ground operations across human space. "With respect, Madam President, this isn't our fight. We have 12 colonies to protect and barely enough ships to patrol our own space. If we send our fleet to help the Zolari, what happens if someone attacks Earth while we're gone?" The room fell silent for a moment. Everyone knew that General Hughes was speaking practical truth. Humanity was still new to galactic politics, having only made contact with alien civilizations 20 years earlier. The Terran Federation was tiny compared to the great powers that dominated the galaxy. Colonel Amy Foster spoke up from across the table. She was young for her rank, but her record from the Colonial Defense Forces was impressive. "General Hughes makes valid points about our military limitations," she said. "But we need to consider why we formed the Terran Federation in the first place. Our charter states that we stand for the protection of all sentient life. How can we ignore a plea for help just because it's dangerous?" Secretary of Defense Robert Grant pulled up another display showing intercepted Vorthon communications. Our intelligence people have been monitoring the situation. The Vorthans aren't just conquering the Zalari homeworld, they're systematically destroying anything they can't use. Hospitals, schools, cultural centers. This isn't just conquest, it's genocide. President Santos had been quiet during most of the discussion, but now she spoke. What about Captain Morrison's report from the USS Horizon? He's actually been to the Zalari system. Admiral Collins activated a new display showing Jake Morrison's detailed observations. Captain Morrison arrived in the system 3 days ago. His ship is too small to take on Vorthan warships, but he's been monitoring the situation and helping coordinate evacuations. His reports paint a picture of complete devastation. The President read Morrison's latest message aloud. The Vorthans are targeting civilian population centers without regard for military value. I've watched them destroy hospitals full of wounded refugees. The Zalari are trying to evacuate their children to the outer planets, but Vorthan fighters are hunting down the refugee ships. These people have done nothing wrong except trust that the galaxy has some basic sense of decency. Dr. Elena Martinez, the President's science advisor, brought up another concern. We should also consider what we're losing if the Zalari civilization is destroyed. Their medical knowledge is among the most advanced in the galaxy. They've developed treatments for diseases that still kill humans. Their research into genetic therapy could add decades to human lifespan. General Hughes stood up, his face red with frustration. With all due respect to everyone here, we're talking about sending our entire fleet against an enemy that outguns us 5-1. This isn't a movie where the good guys win because they're right. This is reality, and in reality, our ships will be destroyed, and our people will die. Admiral Collins nodded grimly. The General is right about the odds, but I've been looking at the tactical situation, and we might have one advantage. The Vorthans have never fought humans before. They don't know our capabilities or our tactics. Surprise might level the playing field, at least initially. Colonel Foster pulled up the latest fleet readiness reports. We have 8 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 2 carriers ready for immediate deployment. The destroyers are fast and maneuverable, designed for hit-and-run attacks rather than direct confrontation. Our fighter squadrons train for close support missions that no other species uses. You're talking about tactical advantages against an empire that has conquered dozens of worlds, General Hughes replied. They didn't build their fleet by being incompetent. President Santos stood up and walked to the main display showing the Zalari homeworld. The planet looked beautiful from space, with blue oceans and green continents. It was hard to imagine that such a peaceful-looking world was currently being torn apart by war. I've been reading the cultural reports about the Zalari, the President said. For 3,000 years, they've devoted themselves to healing and helping others. When the plague hit our colony on New Australia, they sent medical supplies without being asked. When the earthquake destroyed half of New Geneva, Zalari rescue teams worked alongside our people for months. She turned to face the room. Every person in this room knows the story of how the Zalari helped humanity when we were struggling to establish our first colonies. They asked for nothing in return. They just wanted to help because it was the right thing to do. Director Sarah Kim of the intelligence agency spoke up. Our deep space monitoring stations have intercepted the Galactic Council vote. 847-3 against helping the Zalari. The entire galaxy is turning its back on them. Which brings us back to the fundamental question, the President said. What kind of people do we want to be? Do we hide behind our borders and let good people die because it's safer? Or do we stand up for what's right even when the odds are against us? Admiral Collins straightened in his chair. Madam President, if you give the order, we'll be ready to deploy within 48 hours. The crew volunteers alone would probably man half the fleet. The Marines are ready too, Colonel Foster added. We might be small, but we're not cowards. General Hughes sighed deeply. If we're really going to do this, I want it on record that I think it's military suicide. But if the order comes down, the Corps will do its duty. President Santos looked around the room one more time. These were good people who had spent their lives serving humanity. They deserved a leader who would make the hard choices. Prep the fleet, she said finally. We're going to Kepler 442b. Send a message to the Galactic Council informing them of our decision, and get me a direct line to Captain Morrison. I want him to tell the Zalari that help is coming. As the meeting broke up and the military leaders hurried off to prepare their forces, President Santos remained in the room with Director Kim. Sarah, the president said, do you think we have any chance of success? The intelligence director considered the question carefully. Honestly, probably not. The Vorthans have us outgunned in every category, but sometimes being right matters more than being smart. If we can save even some of the Zalari, it might be worth it. President Santos nodded. Get me everything our spies know about Vorthon tactics and weaknesses. If we're going to do this, we need every advantage we can get. As news of the decision spread through Earth's military bases, something remarkable happened. Volunteers stepped forward from every branch of service. Pilots, engineers, Marines, medics. Everyone wanted to be part of the mission to save the Zalari. For the first time in galactic history, humanity was about to show the universe what it meant to answer. A call for help. The human fleet moved through hyperspace like a spear thrust into the darkness. 14 ships in total. 8 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 2 carriers raced toward a distant world that most of the crews had never heard of until a week ago. Admiral Ben Carter stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace through the main view screen. Carter was a veteran of the border wars, where human colonies had fought off pirate raids and territorial disputes with aggressive neighbors. He was used to being outnumbered, but never quite like this. The intelligence reports made it clear that the human fleet would be facing odds that would make most military commanders surrender before the first shot was fired. Admiral, called Lieutenant Commander Kate Morgan from the communications station, we're receiving another transmission from the Zalari homeworld. Carter walked over to listen. The voice that came through the speakers was weak and filled with static, but the desperation was clear even across the language barrier. Dr. Matt Green, the fleet's xenobiologist, was working with Professor Helen Ross, a linguist they had picked up from the Mars University, to translate the messages. What are they saying, Doctor? Carter asked. Dr. Green looked up from his translation computer, his face grim. It's Queen Lyra again. She's reporting that the capital city of Solace is under direct attack. Vorthon ground forces have broken through the outer defenses. She's asking if anyone is coming to help them. Professor Ross, a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, shook her head sadly. Admiral, I've been studying the linguistic patterns in these transmissions. The Zalari language has very specific ways of expressing hope and despair. 3 weeks ago, their messages were full of hope that someone would answer their call. Now they're just saying goodbye. Carter felt a cold anger building in his chest. The human fleet was still 2 weeks away from the Zalari system. 2 weeks that might as well be 2 years for the people dying on Kepler 442b. Send a message back. To them, Carter ordered. Tell them that the human fleet is coming. Tell them to hold on. Sir, Dr. Green said carefully, they might not understand why humans would help them. We're not members of the Galactic Council. We have no treaties with them. From their perspective, we're just another unknown species. Then tell them we're coming because it's the right thing to do, Carter replied. Some things don't need treaties. Throughout the fleet, similar conversations were taking place. On the carrier UES Independence, Captain Sue Walsh was briefing her fighter squadrons about Vorthan combat tactics. The intelligence reports showed that Vorthan fighters were heavily armored but not very maneuverable. Human fighters were designed for speed and agility rather than heavy firepower. The key is going to be hit-and-run attacks, Captain Walsh explained to her pilots. We can't trade shots with them because they'll win every time, but if we can use our speed advantage, we might be able to whittle them down. Lieutenant Tony Rivera, one of the squadron leaders, raised his hand. Captain, what about the Zalari? Are we going to have friendly fire problems if we're fighting in their space? The Zalari don't have a military, Walsh replied. Their entire civilization is based on healing and peaceful cooperation. Any armed ship we encounter in that system is either human or enemy. On the destroyer UES Ranger, Captain Joe Barnes was dealing with a different problem. His ship's engineer, Chief Pete Rodriguez, had discovered that human energy signatures were different from any other species the Vorthons had encountered. Captain, Rodriguez explained, our fusion reactors operate on a frequency that doesn't match anything in the galactic databases. The Vorthons probably have sensors designed to track Quellian or Draknari ships, but they've never seen human technology. Barnes considered this information. You're saying we might be able to sneak up on them? More than that, sir. I think I can modify our sensor dampeners to hide our energy signatures completely. We'd be invisible to their detection systems until we started shooting. This was potentially huge news. Barnes immediately sent the information to Admiral Carter, who ordered every ship in the fleet to implement Rodriguez's modifications. As the days passed, the fleet continued to receive updates from the Zalari system. Each transmission was worse than the last. Cities were falling one by one. Refugee ships trying to evacuate civilians were being hunted down by Vorthon patrol squadrons. The beautiful world that the Zalari had called home for thousands of years was being systematically destroyed. Major Alex Thompson, commanding the Marine detachment aboard the Defiance, was studying what little intelligence they had about Vorthan. Ground tactics. His soldiers would be the first humans ever to fight on an alien world, and he wanted them to be ready. Sergeant Lisa Mitchell, he called to his senior non-commissioned officer. What do you think about these Vorthon infantry? Reports? Sergeant Mitchell looked over the data carefully. She was a veteran of urban warfare training and had experience in hostile environments. Sir, they fight like they've never faced guerrilla tactics. Everything is straightforward frontal assault. They use their superior firepower to overwhelm defenders. That's what I was thinking too, Thompson replied. They're used to fighting species that think like them, but humans don't fight fair when lives are on the line. The Marine detachment was small, only 200 soldiers, but they were all volunteers who had specifically asked to be part of the mission. They knew they would likely be fighting alongside Zalari defenders who had no military training, but that didn't discourage them. In the fleet's medical bay, Dr. Sandy Williams was preparing for casualties. She had studied what little was known about human Zalari medical compatibility, working with the few Zalari medical texts that human scientists had translated. The good news is that basic human medical techniques should work on Zalari physiology, she explained to her medical team. The bad news is that we don't know how Zalari medicine might help our wounded. Chief Medical Officer Paul Anderson looked over the supply lists. We're going into a major battle with medical supplies for a 3-week mission. If this turns into a long campaign, we're going to run out of everything. On the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Carter was facing the same supply problems across the entire fleet. They had ammunition for a few major battles, fuel for a month of operations, and food for 6 weeks. If they couldn't win quickly, the human fleet would be stranded in enemy territory with no way to get home. Commander Nick Taylor, Carter's tactical officer, was working on battle plans that took these limitations into account. "Admiral, we can't fight a traditional campaign against the Vorthons. We need to hit them hard and fast, then get out before they can bring their full strength to bear." "What do you have in mind?" Carter asked. Taylor pulled up a holographic display of the Zalari system. "We use Chief Rodriguez's stealth modifications to get close to their fleet. Then we concentrate all our firepower on their command ships. If we can disrupt their coordination, their numerical advantage becomes less important." It was a risky plan that depended on everything going right, but it was better than anything else they had. Carter approved the tactical framework and ordered all ship commanders to study the plan. As the fleet entered its final week of travel to the Zalari system, the transmissions from Queen Lyra became more sporadic. The royal palace was under direct attack, and the Zalari were running out of safe places to broadcast from. But they kept sending messages, and the human fleet kept listening. In 2 more weeks, the galaxy would learn whether the newcomers from Earth were serious about their promise to help those in need. The longest journey of human history was almost over, and the real test was about to begin. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zalari system, and Admiral Ben Carter immediately understood why no one had come to help. The display screens showed the massive Vorthon blockade stretched across every possible approach to Kepler 442b. Dozens of enormous dreadnoughts hung in space like metallic mountains, each one larger than the biggest human ship. "Dear God," whispered Commander Nick Taylor from his position at the tactical station. "Intelligence said they were big, but this—" Carter studied the enemy formation with a professional eye. The Vorthons had positioned their largest ships to cover all the major hyperspace routes leading into the system. Smaller cruisers and destroyers patrolled the spaces between the giants, creating an overlapping network of sensors and weapons that would detect and destroy any approaching fleet long before it could reach the planet. "Communications. Patch me through to the fleet," Carter ordered. "All ships, this is Admiral Carter. I know what you're all seeing on your displays, and yes, it looks impossible. But remember why we're here. Down on that planet are millions of innocent people who are counting on us to do something that the rest of the galaxy was too afraid to try." He paused, looking around at his bridge crew. These were good people who had volunteered to risk their lives for strangers on the other side of the galaxy. "We're going to do what humans do best. We're going to improvise. Carter out." The Admiral turned to his tactical officer. "Nick, tell me you've got some kind of plan for getting through that wall of ships." Commander Taylor pulled up a detailed analysis of the Vorthon formation. "Actually, sir, I think their size might work against them. Those dreadnoughts are designed to fight other big ships. They're not set up to track small, fast targets." Captain Sue Walsh's voice came over the communications system from the carrier Independence. "Admiral, my fighter squadrons are ready to begin reconnaissance runs. We can use their speed to map the patrol patterns." "Negative, Captain Walsh," Carter replied. "If we send fighters out there now, the Vorthans will know we're here. We need to get closer before we reveal ourselves." Chief Engineer Pete Rodriguez had been monitoring the enemy fleet from his position aboard the destroyer Ranger. His modifications to the human energy signatures were working perfectly. The Vorthon sensors couldn't detect the human ships at their current distance. "Admiral," Rodriguez's voice crackled over the communications channel, "I'm reading something interesting about their formation. Those big ships are broadcasting a lot of sensor data, but they're not designed to look for anything smaller than a cruiser. I think we can get our destroyers right up to their picket line without being detected." This was the break Carter had been hoping for. "All destroyer commanders, this is Admiral Carter. Prepare for stealth approach. Use minimal power and stay below their sensor threshold." Captain Joe Barnes took his destroyer Ranger on the first reconnaissance run. The ship crept through space like a submarine in enemy waters, using every trick Pete Rodriguez had developed to hide their presence. As they got closer to the Vorthan line, the true scale of the enemy became apparent. "God!" said Barnes's navigator, Lieutenant Amy Cooper. "That closest dreadnought is over 2 miles long. It has more guns than our entire fleet combined." But Rodriguez had been right about the Vorthan sensors. The massive ships were designed to detect and fight enemies of similar size. Their sensors passed right over the small human destroyer without noticing it. "Captain Barnes to Admiral Carter," Joe whispered into his communicator. "We found a weak spot in their formation. There's a gap between patrol sectors that's only covered by automated sensors. If we time it right, we might be able to slip the entire fleet through." Carter felt the first real hope he'd had since seeing the blockade. "Send us the data, Captain. All ships prepare for coordinated stealth approach." The plan that emerged was impossibly complex and dangerous. The human fleet would split into small groups and approach the Vorthan line from multiple directions. They would use the gaps in patrol coverage to get close enough to launch a coordinated attack on the command ships. Lieutenant Commander Kate Morgan was piloting one of the destroyers through the maze of enemy ships when she noticed something important. "Admiral, the Vorthans are using a centralized command structure. All the smaller ships are taking orders from a single dreadnought in the center of their formation." This was valuable intelligence. If they could disable the command ship, the entire blockade might become disorganized. "Target identified," Carter announced to the fleet. "All attack groups converge on the command dreadnought. We hit it with everything we have, then get out before they know what happened." The attack began with the launch of every fighter squadron in the human fleet. The small, fast ships streaked toward the Vorthan formation while the larger human vessels moved into position. The Vorthans finally detected the approaching fighters, but by then it was too late to stop the coordinated assault. Captain Walsh led her fighter squadrons in a direct attack on the command ship's sensor arrays. Human fighters were designed for close-range combat, and they swarmed over the massive dreadnought like angry wasps, their weapons targeting critical systems. At the same time, the human destroyers emerged from stealth and opened fire with everything they had. Their weapons were smaller than the Vorthan guns, but they were aimed at vulnerable points that the enemy had never bothered to protect heavily. Commander Taylor's plan worked perfectly for the first few minutes. The Vorthans were so surprised by the sudden appearance of an unknown enemy that their response was slow and uncoordinated. But once they recovered from the initial shock, their numerical advantage began to tell. "Admiral," called Lieutenant Morgan from her position at the sensor station. "Multiple Vorthan ships are moving to intercept us. We've got about 5 minutes before they bring their main guns to bear." Carter made the decision that would define the entire battle. Instead of retreating to a safe distance, he ordered the human fleet to push deeper into the Vorthan formation. "All ships maximum attack speed. We're going to punch right through their center and break this blockade open." The USS Independence launched its second fighter wave while the destroyers concentrated. Their fire on the command dreadnought. Slowly, the massive Vorthan ship began to show damage. Its sensor arrays went offline, then its communication systems, then its main weapons. But the price was high. The destroyer UES Falcon took a direct hit from a Vorthan heavy cruiser and exploded in a ball of fire. The cruiser UES Manhattan lost its engines and began drifting helplessly through the battle zone. "Admiral," reported Captain Barnes from the Ranger, "Rodriguez has an idea for finishing this quickly." "Let's hear it," Carter replied, while watching enemy ships closing in from all directions. "We overload our reactor cores and detonate them. Next to the command ship," Rodriguez explained over the communication system. "The explosion should be big enough to cripple their flagship and create a gap in their formation." It was essentially a suicide mission, but Carter could see that conventional weapons weren't going to be enough. "Negative, Chief. We're not sacrificing any ships unless we have no choice." But Rodriguez had a different idea. "Sir, we don't need to sacrifice a ship. We can overload the reactor on one of our escape pods and use it as a guided missile." The plan was crazy enough to work. Captain Barnes volunteered his ship to provide the improvised weapon, and Chief Rodriguez worked frantically to turn an escape pod into a bomb capable of crippling a dreadnought. When the modified pod streaked toward the Vorthon command ship, the enemy point defense systems tried to stop it. But the small target was moving too fast and was too close to their own vessel for them to risk using heavy weapons. The explosion lit up space for several seconds. When the light faded, the Vorthon command dreadnought was dead in space, its command center destroyed and its systems offline. Without their flagship coordinating the defense, the Vorthon blockade began to fall apart. Ship commanders had to make their own decisions, and many of them made the mistake of pursuing the human fleet instead of maintaining their positions. "All ships, through the gap," Carter ordered. "Make for the planet. Maximum speed." The human fleet raced through the opening they had created, leaving the confused Vorthon blockade behind them. They had lost one destroyer and had several ships damaged, but they had accomplished the impossible. They had broken through the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. As Kepler 442b grew larger on their screens, Admiral Carter allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The hard part was just beginning, but they had proven that humans would keep their promises, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The beautiful blue-green world of Kepler 442b filled the screens of the human fleet as they approached the planet. But the beauty was marred by the ugly scars of war. Massive fires burned across several continents and the orbital space around. The planet was filled with the wreckage of destroyed ships and stations. Admiral Ben Carter stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the tactical displays that showed the full scope of the disaster. The Vorthon ground invasion was in its final stages. Most of the planet's major cities had fallen, and Vorthon forces were closing in on the capital city of Solace, where Queen Lyra was making her last stand. "Communications, patch me through to the Zalari Queen," Carter ordered. The response came quickly, though the signal was weak and filled with static. When Queen Lyra's image appeared on the main screen, Carter was shocked by what he saw. The elegant alien leader he had seen in diplomatic files looked exhausted and wounded. Behind her, the royal palace was burning. "This is Admiral Ben Carter of the Terran Federation," he said. "Your Majesty, we received your call for help. We're here to assist in your defense." Queen Lyra stared at the screen in disbelief. After weeks of silence from the galaxy, she had given up hope that anyone would answer her people's desperate plea. "Admiral Carter," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Forgive me, but I do not understand. Why would humans risk their lives for people they have never met?" Carter thought about all the debates and arguments that had led to this moment. "Your Majesty, sometimes doing the right thing is reason enough." The Queen's eyes filled with tears. "Admiral, I must tell you, Honestly, our situation is hopeless. The Vorthans have over 50,000 troops on the planet. We have perhaps 2,000 security officers with light weapons. Our capital will fall within hours. Ma'am, we didn't come all this way to give up now, Carter replied. Can you give us tactical information about Vorthan positions? General, Kiran appeared beside Queen Lyra on the screen. The Zalari military leader looked grim but determined. Admiral, the Vorthans have concentrated their forces for a final assault on Solace. They have heavy artillery and air support. Our people are fighting with medical equipment and farming tools. Carter turned to his tactical officer. Commander Taylor, analysis? Nick Taylor studied the planetary displays that were coming in from their reconnaissance drones. Sir, the Vorthans are using conventional assault tactics, overwhelming firepower applied to break defensive lines. They're not expecting any kind of sophisticated resistance. Major Thompson, Carter called to the Marine commander. How quickly? Can you get your people ready for deployment? Major Alex Thompson had been listening to the conversation with growing anger. The idea of heavily armed soldiers attacking civilians with medical equipment made him sick. Admiral, we can have the first wave on the ground in 30 minutes. But, sir, 200 Marines against 50,000 Vorthans. We're not fighting all 50,000, Carter interrupted. We're buying time for the Zalari to organize a proper defense. And we're showing the Vorthans that someone is willing to fight back. The plan that emerged was born of desperation and human stubbornness. Half the fleet would remain in orbit to provide air support and deal with Vorthan reinforcements. The other half would land ground forces and establish defensive positions around the capital city. Captain Sue Walsh launched her fighter squadrons to provide close air support for the ground troops. Human fighters had never been used in this role against alien forces, but Walsh was confident her pilots could adapt. All squadrons, this is Falcon Leader, she announced over the communications net. Remember, the Zalari are wearing blue and white uniforms. Everyone else is a target. Try not to blow up any hospitals. These people are healers. The first human dropships landed in the outskirts of Solace, just as Vorthan artillery began pounding the city center. Major Thompson led his Marines out of the landing craft and immediately began setting up defensive positions. The difference between human and Vorthan military doctrine became apparent within minutes. The Vorthans fought like a conventional army with organized formations and predictable tactics. The humans fought like guerrillas, using every piece of cover and turning every building into a fortress. Sergeant Lisa Mitchell took her squad through the city's medical district, where Zalari doctors were still trying to treat wounded civilians despite the bombardment. Ma'am, she said to Dr. Veltar, one of the Zalari physicians, we need to evacuate your patients to safer positions. Dr. Veltar looked at the human soldier with amazement. Sergeant, why are your people risking your lives for us? We are strangers to you. Mitchell thought about the question while helping move wounded Zalari to underground shelters. Doc, where I come from, we don't let bullies hurt innocent people if we can help it. The human defensive strategy was unlike anything the Vorthans had encountered. Instead of trying to hold fixed positions, the Marines used hit-and-run tactics, striking at Vorthan columns and then disappearing into the city's maze of streets and buildings. General Kiran found himself working alongside human officers to coordinate the defense. The Zalari had no real military experience, but they knew their city and were motivated to protect their homes. Major Thompson, Kiran said, our people can guide your soldiers through the underground medical tunnels. The Vorthans don't know about these passages. Thompson grinned. General, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Above the planet, Admiral Carter was fighting a different kind of battle. Vorthan dropships were trying to land additional troops, and the human fleet was doing everything possible to stop them. "Captain Barnes," Carter ordered, "take your destroyers and intercept those troop transports. Don't let them reach the surface." The space battle was intense but brief. Human ships were faster and more maneuverable than the lumbering Vorthan transports, and several enemy ships were destroyed before they could land their troops. On the ground, the tide of battle began to shift as human tactics spread to the Zalari defenders. Medical personnel who had never held weapons learned to use captured Vorthan equipment. The city's healing centers became fortified positions where wounded fighters could be treated and then returned to battle. Lieutenant Tony Rivera's fighter squadron discovered that Vorthan ground vehicles were vulnerable to attacks from above. "All aircraft, this is Rivera. These guys have no air defense doctrine. They're sitting ducks." The Vorthan commander, General Maltok, found his carefully planned assault falling apart as his forces encountered resistance tactics he had never seen before. His troops were trained to fight other conventional armies, not an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. "Admiral Corax," he reported to the fleet commander, "the defenders are using unknown tactics. My forces are taking heavy casualties, and we've made no progress toward the Capitol building." Admiral Corax was having his own problems in space. The human fleet was small, but it was proving to be surprisingly effective. "General, you have 50,000 troops against a few hundred defenders. How is this possible?" "Sir, these humans fight like nothing we've encountered. They don't follow any recognized military doctrine, and they're somehow coordinating with the Zalari civilians." As the day wore on, news of the battle spread throughout the galaxy. For the first time in centuries, someone was successfully resisting a Vorthan invasion. On worlds across known space, people watched their news feeds with amazement as a tiny human fleet held off the most feared military force in the galaxy. By evening, the situation had stabilized around Solace. The Vorthans controlled the outer parts of the city, but the humans and Zalari held the center, including the royal palace and the major medical facilities. Queen Lyra found Admiral Carter in a temporary command post that had been set up in the basement of the royal hospital. "Admiral," she said, "I wanted to thank you personally. Whatever happens now, you've given my people something we had lost: hope." Carter looked tired but determined. "Your Majesty, this is just the beginning. We're going to push these invaders off your world and make sure they never come back." The Queen smiled for the first time in weeks. "Admiral, I believe you actually mean that." As night fell over Solace, human and Zalari fighters prepared for the next day's battle. They were still outnumbered, but they had proven something important. Sometimes courage and determination could overcome superior numbers and firepower. The last stand was becoming something else entirely: the first victory. The second day of the Battle of Solace began with a surprise that Admiral Corax of the Vorthan Empire had not expected. Instead of the demoralized defenders he had anticipated facing, his sensors detected new ships arriving in the system. More humans were coming, and they were bringing reinforcements. Admiral Grace Thompson led the second human fleet into the Zalari system with grim determination. Her force was smaller than Admiral Carter's, only 6 ships, but every one of them was crewed by volunteers who had insisted on joining the fight. News of the battle had spread across human space, and people were demanding the chance to help. "Admiral Carter, this is Admiral Thompson aboard the UES Liberty," Grace announced as her ships took position alongside the original fleet. "Sorry, we're late to the party. We brought some friends. Carter felt a surge of relief as he watched the tactical displays update with friendly ship positions. "Admiral Thompson, you're a sight for sore eyes. We can use every ship you brought." The reinforcements included the heavy cruiser UES Constitution, 2 destroyers, and 3 transports full of marine reinforcements. More importantly, they brought news that Earth was mobilizing its entire fleet for additional support. Down on the planet's surface, Major Alex Thompson was leading a dawn attack on Vorthon positions when he received word of the naval reinforcements. "Sergeant Mitchell," he called to his senior NCO, "looks like the cavalry is coming after all." Sergeant Lisa Mitchell was coordinating with a group of Zalari volunteers who had learned to use captured Vorthon weapons. The aliens were quick learners, and their medical knowledge made them surprisingly good at targeting weak points in enemy armor. "Sir," Mitchell replied, "these Zalari are tougher than they look. Dr. Veltar just took out a Vorthon tank with an improvised explosive. The human reinforcements changed the entire dynamic of the ground battle. Captain Tony Rivera's expanded fighter squadrons began systematic attacks on Vorthon supply lines, cutting off forward units from their support bases. The aliens had never faced an enemy that could control the air so effectively." General Maltok found his carefully organized invasion turning into a chaotic nightmare. His troops were being hit from all directions by an enemy that seemed to understand warfare in ways his military manuals had never covered. "Admiral Corax," he reported, "the human reinforcements have brought new weapons and tactics. They're using precision airstrikes to isolate my formations, then attacking with combined infantry and armor assaults. My casualties are becoming unsustainable." Admiral Corax was facing his own crisis in space. The additional human ships had brought new technologies that his fleet had never encountered. Chief Engineer Pete Rodriguez had shared his stealth modifications with the entire human force, making it impossible for Vorthon sensors to track all the enemy vessels. "Captain Barnes," Admiral Carter ordered, "take your task force and hit their supply ships. Without reinforcements and ammunition, their ground forces will have to retreat." Captain Joe Barnes led his destroyers in a series of lightning raids against Vorthon logistics vessels. The enemy ships were designed for cargo transport, not combat, and they fell easily to coordinated human attacks. The breakthrough came when Captain Sue Walsh discovered a weakness in Vorthon command structure. "Admiral Carter," she reported from her carrier, "I'm monitoring their communications, and it looks like their entire operation depends on real-time orders from Admiral Corax. If we can jam their communications, their ground forces will be operating blind." This was exactly the kind of tactical insight that human forces specialized in. Within hours, every ship in the human fleet was broadcasting interference on Vorthon communication frequencies. The effect on the ground was immediate and dramatic. Vorthon units that had been advancing in coordinated formations suddenly found themselves isolated and confused. Without orders from their commanders, many troops simply stopped fighting and tried to retreat to their landing zones. Queen Lyra watched the battle from her command center in the royal palace, amazed by the transformation in her planet's situation. "General Kiran," she said to her military advisor, 3 days ago we were facing extinction. Now we're winning." Kiran nodded, still hardly believing what he was seeing. "Your Majesty, these humans fight like nothing we've ever seen. They don't just use superior firepower. They think their way around problems." The turning point came when Sergeant Mitchell's squad located Admiral Corax's personal shuttle during a reconnaissance mission to evacuate Vorthon leadership. The shuttle was heavily guarded, but it represented an opportunity to capture the enemy. "Commander, Major Thompson," Mitchell reported, "I've got eyes on the Vorthon admiral. He's trying to evacuate from the primary landing zone. If we can capture him, this whole invasion might collapse. Thompson immediately organized a joint human-Zalari assault on the landing zone. The operation was risky, but the potential payoff was enormous. If they could capture or kill the Vorthon commander, the enemy fleet might retreat entirely. The assault began with airstrikes from Captain Rivera's fighters, followed by a ground attack led by human marines and Zalari volunteers. The battle was fierce, with Vorthon guards fighting desperately to protect their admiral. In the middle of the firefight, Sergeant Mitchell found herself face-to-face with Admiral Corax himself. The Vorthon commander was larger and stronger than any human, but Mitchell had advantages he didn't expect. "Surrender!" she ordered, pointing her weapon at the alien admiral. "Your invasion is over." Corax laughed at the small human soldier. "You think your tiny fleet can defeat the Vorthon Empire? We have thousands of ships." "Maybe," Mitchell replied, calmly. "But right now, we've got you." The capture of Admiral Corax sent shockwaves through the Vorthon fleet. Without their commanding officer, the remaining ships began a disorganized retreat from the system. Some ship captains tried to continue the battle, but most decided that discretion was the better part of valor. General Maltok received orders from the retreating fleet to evacuate all ground forces immediately. "All units, fall back to evacuation. Points. This operation is terminated." But the retreat turned into a rout as human and Zalari forces pursued the fleeing Vorthans. Years of aggression and conquest were being reversed in a matter of hours by an enemy the Vorthans had never taken seriously. Dr. Matt Green, the human xenobiologist, found himself serving as an impromptu translator during Admiral Corax's interrogation. The Vorthon commander was arrogant and uncooperative, but he was also clearly shaken by his defeat. "Your empire has conquered dozens of worlds," Queen Lyra said to the captured admiral. "Why did you choose to attack a peaceful people who had done you no harm?" Corax glared at her with obvious contempt. "Because you were weak, and weakness invites conquest. That is the way of the galaxy." Admiral Carter stepped forward. "Not anymore. The galaxy just learned that weak people have friends who aren't weak." As the last Vorthan ships fled the system, celebrations broke out across Solace and the other liberated cities. For the first time in weeks, Zalari children could play in the streets without fear of bombardment. But Carter knew the victory was only temporary. "Admiral Thompson," he said to his colleague, "this is just the beginning. The Vorthon Empire isn't going to forget what happened here." Grace Thompson nodded grimly. "Which means we need to be ready for round 2. Queen Lyra approached, the two human admirals with tears in her eyes. "Admirals Carter and Thompson, how can my people ever repay what you have done for us?" Carter smiled. "Your Majesty, we didn't do this for payment. We did it because it was right. But if you really want to help, we're going to need allies for what comes next." The Battle of Solace was over, but the war for galactic freedom was just beginning. News of the human victory was spreading across known space, and on dozens of worlds, oppressed peoples were beginning to hope that someone might answer their calls for help too. The humans had proven that the Vorthon Empire could be defeated. Now they had to prove that they could build something better in its place. 3 months after the Battle of Solace, representatives from across the galaxy gathered on the rebuilt Zalari homeworld for a ceremony that would reshape interstellar relations forever. The crystal spires of the capital city had been repaired, and new buildings rose alongside the old ones, symbols of renewal and hope. President Maria Santos stepped out of her shuttle onto the landing platform of the Royal Palace, accompanied by Admiral Ben Carter and Dr. Lisa Parker. The trip from Earth had taken 2 weeks, but Santos had insisted on attending the signing ceremony personally. This was too important to leave to ambassadors. Queen Lyra greeted the human delegation with obvious joy. The Zalari leader looked completely different from the desperate, wounded figure Carter had first met during the battle. She was healthy, confident, and surrounded by a thriving civilization that had been saved from extinction. "President Santos," Queen Lyra said, "words cannot, express my people's gratitude for what humanity has done. You answered our call when no one else would listen." Santos smiled warmly. "Your Majesty, we're just glad we could help, but more importantly, we're here to make sure this never happens again." The ceremony was being broadcast across the galaxy, and billions of beings watched as delegates took their seats in the great assembly hall that had been built specifically for this occasion. Representatives from over 60 worlds had come to witness the signing of what was being called the Kepler Accords. Ambassador Zethkar of the Altarian Federation was among the delegates, looking somewhat embarrassed about his government's earlier refusal to help the Zalari. Many of the species that had voted against intervention at the Galactic Council were now eager to be associated with the human victory. "It's amazing how many friends we've discovered we had," Admiral Carter commented quietly to Dr. Parker as they watched the various alien dignitaries find their seats. Dr. Parker, who had been promoted to become humanity's chief diplomat, nodded cynically. Funny how principles become more popular after they're proven successful. The ceremony began with Queen Lyra addressing the assembled delegates. She spoke about the dark days when her people faced extinction and how the silence from the galaxy had almost destroyed their faith in civilized behavior. "But then," she continued, "humanity showed us that there are still people in the galaxy who believe that doing the right thing matters more than calculating profit and risk. Today, we establish the Galactic Defense Alliance to ensure that no peaceful people will ever again face destruction alone." The applause was thunderous, but Santos noticed that not everyone was clapping enthusiastically. Some delegates looked uncomfortable with the implications of what they were signing. Admiral Grace Thompson, who had been promoted to Fleet Admiral and chosen to lead the new Defense Alliance, stood to present the military framework of the agreement. "The Alliance will maintain rapid response fleets positioned throughout the galaxy," she explained. "Any member world that faces unprovoked aggression can activate emergency beacons that will bring immediate assistance. The technology for the emergency beacons had been developed jointly by human engineers and Zalari scientists. The devices were small, but they could broadcast across interstellar distances and were designed to be impossible to jam or disable." Chief Engineer Pete Rodriguez, now wearing the insignia of a full commander, demonstrated one of the beacons for the assembled delegates. "These devices will be distributed to every world that signs the Accords," he explained. "When activated, they send an immediate alert to all Alliance forces, along with tactical information about the threat. Captain Sue Walsh, recently promoted to Commodore, would command one of the Alliance's carrier task forces. Our forces are trained for rapid deployment and unconventional warfare," she told the delegates. "We specialize in evening the odds for defenders facing superior numbers." But the most important speaker was Major Alex Thompson, who had become something of a galactic celebrity after leading the ground defense of Solace. Now a colonel, he represented the Alliance's commitment to protecting civilians as well as governments. "The Alliance isn't just about fighting wars," Thompson explained. "We're about making sure that bullies understand there will always be consequences for attacking innocent people." Sergeant Lisa Mitchell, now a captain, had become the Alliance's chief training officer for irregular warfare. Her job was to teach defensive tactics to species that had never needed military forces before. "The galaxy is changing," Mitchell told the assembled delegates. "The old way of doing business, where the strong could prey on the weak without consequences, is over. From now on, peaceful people have guardians." As the formal speeches concluded, President Santos was invited to sign the founding document of the Galactic Defense Alliance. The ceremony was broadcast live across human space, where people gathered in public squares and community centers to watch their leader make history. With this signature, Santos declared, humanity commits itself to the defense of all peaceful peoples. No cry for help will go unanswered as long as human ships can reach the stars. Queen Lyra signed next, followed by representatives from dozens of worlds that had chosen to join the Alliance. The Galactic Council had formally endorsed the Accords, though some members had done so reluctantly. But there was one notable absence from the ceremony. The Vorthon Empire had refused to attend, and intelligence reports suggested they were rebuilding their fleet for another attempt at expansion. Admiral Korax, still in Zalari custody, had been interviewed by Galactic News Services. His message was defiant. "This alliance is temporary. Humans are a small, weak species that got lucky once. The Vorthon Empire has existed for 1,000 years. We will outlast these upstarts." After the formal ceremony, President Santos met privately with Queen Lyra and the senior Alliance commanders. The room was secure, allowing them to discuss matters that couldn't be shared with the general public. "The Vorthons aren't going to give up," Admiral Carter warned. "Our intelligence people think they're planning a massive retaliation within the next year." "Let them come," Fleet Admiral Thompson replied grimly. "We'll be ready this time." Dr. Parker pulled up star charts showing the current political situation. "The Alliance has grown faster than we expected. 47 worlds have signed the Accords, and 12 more are considering membership. But the Vorthons still have allies among the older empires." Queen Lyra looked thoughtful. "Admiral Carter, do you really think this alliance can survive? We're asking very different species to work together for abstract principles." Carter smiled. "Your Majesty, humans have been asking that same question about our own species for centuries. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But when it does work, it's worth all the effort." As the meeting concluded, Captain Jake Morrison arrived with urgent news. The USS Horizon had been exploring the far reaches of the galaxy when they received the first activation of an Alliance emergency beacon. "Admirals," Morrison reported, "we've got a situation in the Rigel sector. A species called the Korani are under attack by slavers. They've activated their beacon and are requesting immediate assistance." Fleet Admiral Thompson looked around the room. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we signed up for. How quickly? Can we deploy a response force?" "The Second Fleet can be underway in 6 hours," Admiral Carter replied. 3 destroyers, a cruiser, and a carrier group, plus marine reinforcements." President Santos felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern as she watched her military leaders plan their next mission. "Admiral Thompson, you understand that this deployment will be closely watched by the entire galaxy. If we succeed, it proves the Alliance works. If we fail, we won't fail, Madam President," Thompson replied with quiet confidence. "We've learned too much and come too far to fail now." As news of the Korani crisis spread, volunteer crews began reporting to their ships across Alliance space. The emergency beacon system was working exactly as designed, and help was already on the way to another world in need. Queen Lyra stood on her palace balcony, watching human ships prepare to depart for their next mission. 3 months ago, she had sent a desperate plea into space, hoping someone somewhere would care enough to help. Now that same technology was being used to coordinate the defense of freedom across the galaxy. "Your Majesty," General Kieran said, joining her on the balcony, "do you think this alliance will really change things?" Queen Lyra smiled as she watched the human fleet accelerate toward the stars. "General, I've learned something about humans over these past months. When they make a promise, they keep it. And they've promised that no call for help will go unanswered. Far across the galaxy, on dozens of worlds where oppressive governments had once ruled without challenge, people looked up at the stars with new hope. The age of unchallenged tyranny was ending, and in its place was rising something that the galaxy had never seen before: a true community of civilized worlds, protected by people who understood that freedom was worth fighting for. The call for help had been answered, and the galaxy would never be the same.